All right, now it's time to dive into the first personality type. This is session number 19, and we're going to be talking about the ENTP or exploration accuracy type. And this is in each of the PDF profiles that we offer at Personality Hacker, we have a cheat sheet page, and I have taken the cheat sheet to make it so that we have a good overview of this personality type. Now, if you notice, in the driver process for ENTPs is the exploration process, exploration or extroverted intuition. That is ENTP's driver process. The co-pilot is introverted thinking or accuracy. The 10-year-old is extroverted feeling or harmony, and the 3-year-old is introverted sensing or memory. Now, what I want you to notice, I want you to go through that list that I mentioned, and I'll be walking you through it as we go through. But I really want you to be looking for that list of criteria. Are they leading with a judging or perceiving function? Okay, so ENTPs lead with a perceiving function. Okay, that's what they're leading with. They're leading with exploration. That means that ENTPs see life in a very open frame. Exploration is that process, as you know, as we talked about, exploration is that process that loves to engage with the environment, that loves to mess with it, that loves to see patterns come from the environment by interacting and engaging with it. And all it wants is to have new possibilities be shown. That is how exploration works. So the effectively, sort of a summary of that is that they're passionate, persuasive, innovative, they fall in love with ideas, they love to experiment about the world, and they become comfortable with the uncomfortable. All right, they find new innovative ways to do the same old job, and they tend to be very scientifically and socially creative. That's exploration, right? Mess with the environment, see what comes from it, you know, try to observe new possibilities, new patterns, very optimistic. And in order to do that, they have to marry that with an introverted judging process, right? Their driver is an extroverted perceiving process. That means it's interacting with the outside world, open frame, learn. But in order to be a rounded out person, they have to marry that with an introverted judging process. And so they couple that with accuracy. Now, because they lead with exploration, they have a tendency to be fairly open-minded. It is rare when an ENTP is closed-minded. It's rare when they are highly judgmental of novelty in any sense, which means that when somebody is evidencing something that's outside of their frame, they aren't immediately asking themselves if this is good or bad or right or wrong. They're curious. They lead with a curiosity streak. And so they tend to be fairly non-judgmental of other people. They tend to be fairly open frame. And anything that surprises them is delightful. All right? It is delightful to be surprised. In order to be a complete person, though, they have to bring in that accuracy process. And accuracy is about what makes sense, right? It's about creating frameworks in order to manage enormous amounts of data. In order to understand something, you have all this information you've taken in, and so ENTPs have a tendency to be they're very much self-educators, or they seek education that will give them lots of data points. So they're marrying this idea of wanting to get as much information about the world and see as many patterns about the world as they possibly can with collecting specific data points that is impersonal. Remember, accuracy is impersonal. It doesn't really want to get emotionally involved. It wants to understand the information itself. And so this is where you get a focus. This is where an exploration person or an ENTP person really gets a deep dive. Exploration zooms out, accuracy zooms in. And so it's the combination of those two things that allows an ENTP to be not only open frame and, you know, messing with the environment, but specifically zooming in to try to figure out exactly what's going on there. Okay, I see a pattern emerging. I see information coming at me, but what does it mean? What's its meaning? Does it make sense? And accuracy, that systems thinking component, that impartial, impersonal systems thinking component, when it's combined with exploration, generally means an ENTP is very interested in things that are scientific. All right? They like models. They like models of human development and behavior. Well, I do. They like models of scientific progress. They like models of machines. They're very innovative. They want to see if they can create something new, but it's not relationship new, it's information new. So when you throw a model at an ENTP, usually what the first thing they're doing is, after they've understood it to a certain extent, they're immediately scanning for every other model they've ever learned to see if they fit. Does this give me a bigger picture to the puzzle? If you're a video gamer, which a lot of ENTPs actually are, ENTPs have a tendency to really enjoy video games and the technology of video games. When you're playing a character or the kind of video game where you have a map, what ends up happening is a lot of maps take an aerial view, and as your character is exploring the terrain, it's a grid pattern initially, and then as the character is exploring the terrain, the map will open up. It'll start to fill in the grid pattern and flesh it out to give the character, or the person who's playing the character, a bigger map. This is a really good metaphor for how ENTPs see the world in general. As they enter the world, they see it as this huge grid pattern. It's a grid pattern of information that needs to be called, data that needs to be mined. And as they explore more, as they take in bigger terrain, now their grid pattern is starting to flesh out with an actual map. And if you've ever played a video game that, like I'm describing, what you'll have is portions of the map fleshed out over here and portions of the map fleshed out over here. And if you see similarities, the first thing you want to do is connect them. You want to see how these things are connected. And remember, exploration sees connections between disparate pieces of information, connections maybe other people miss. Well, now it's a matter of trying to flesh out what the connection is. So in the video game, the character will start heading towards this other map, right? This other portion of the map that's filled out, in order to flesh out this entire portion of the map. Well, that's what's happening inside. This is what's happening inside the mind of an ENTP, is they see this model, and they really want to know how they connect in the middle. So they'll start reverse engineering, or they'll start engineering a new model, or they're really just kind of try to figure out the connective material in between. And so ENTPs end up becoming innovators, not just of like physical inventions. Sometimes they do that too, but it's mostly conceptual new models. It's usually inventiveness with concepts. And then, of course, if the conceptual model internally, if the connection between these two models makes sense in a way that can be used in the outside world, now they'll turn it into a gadget, or they'll turn it into a program, or they'll turn it into something that can be usable by other people, not just themselves. So ENTPs usually look inventive, creative, they look curious, they look non-judgmental, and they're very focused in on data. Now, they can be highly charismatic. Remember, exploration usually is pretty charismatic to other people. And if you do a combination of exploration accuracy, you'll see somebody who's highly charismatic, but not necessarily super personal. So there's this sense of lack of connection, and at the same time a draw. And so ENTPs can be very charismatic to other people, but also a little difficult to pin down. And because they have a sense of novelty and newness, and because they have an impersonal criteria that they're using to make their major decisions, sometimes ENTPs have difficulty sticking with relationships. They can have difficulty figuring out how to stay for the long haul. And that's something that a lot of ENTPs will report, especially like people who have been major inventors in the past, and you discover they're ENTPs, and then you start looking at the personal life, and you'll realize they had like 2 or 3 mates and children from lots of different marriages, right? Because it's tough for them to stay. Now, the more developed they are, the more they'll figure out this piece. The more they'll figure out how to create a win-win situation with their mates and the other relationships in their life. However, if there's too much of the same, if there's too much of being in a rut, if there's too much of a lack of novelty, the ENTP will look for an exit strategy. They'll do everything they can to try to get out of that situation, because staying in a situation that makes them unhappy doesn't make sense. There's no sense of conviction, or usually there's no sense of conviction around having to stay in a miserable situation. And if they have something that is inside them that says they're supposed to stay, a lot of times what they'll end up doing is trying to sabotage the situation in order to look for an exit strategy. Like, if I can just make my mate miserable enough, they might leave, right? If they have conviction around that. But usually they don't have conviction around staying in a situation that's unhappy to them, so it doesn't make sense to stay, so they just leave. So that's one thing that is frequently a marker of ENTPs. That's not to say that they always have relationship problems, but that is something that can show up. Now, the 10-year-old process is the exact reverse opposite of the co-pilot. And so that makes the 10-year-old extroverted feeling or harmony. And the way that, of course, it works for everybody is that the driver and the 10-year-old end up in cahoots with each other if the ENTP is not doing enough personal development work. If they're not doing enough work on themselves and making sure that that co-pilot process is strong, they'll skip the co-pilot and go to the 10-year-old. Well, that relationship between the two oftentimes usually looks like anger, all right? Harmony comes out in a defensive way as being either emotionally manipulative or as being angry. Now, the reason why they end up in allowing themselves to feel anger is most ENTPs are males, all right? The majority of ENTPs are going to be men. And in the cultures that at least I'm familiar with, and this could be different in your particular culture, but at least in this culture, one of the emotions that is considered appropriate for males or not emasculating is the emotion of anger. So a lot of thinkers will say, well, if I go to an emotional place, then anger is an acceptable emotional place, so I'm just going to go ahead and go to that one. Even the females will pick this up. Even the female ENTPs will pick up that anger is one of the few acceptable emotions that a thinker can feel, and so they'll go to anger. Now, if they've done a lot of work on themselves, it makes sense to have a certain level of emotional intelligence. So some ENTPs will go down the road of emotional intelligence. However, they usually do it in a systematic way. I have a friend who's an ENTP who got really into relationships. They're a relationship coach now. They sell information products around relationships. And the reason why they did that is because they could turn relationships and emotions into a system that was manageable and replicable. And so they systematized an understanding of emotional intelligence. Now, that doesn't mean that they themselves have a perfect ideal life now. They still have trouble managing their own personal emotions, but it's gotten them much, much closer to emotional intelligence because they were able to systemize it. And that's frequently what an ENTP will do when they're trying to manage their relation or their emotions, is they'll turn it into a system that has markers, right? And that's oftentimes what a system will do. You'll set up a system to be able to give you markers to let you know when you're, entering a danger zone. So there's not really a lot of natural emotional intelligence that comes with this type. It's more that they create systems to be able to check in with themselves. Like, take, for example, I'll just use myself as an example because I'm here and I'm an ENTP. For me personally, one of the things I noticed is that I would allow my emotions to stack over time. If I felt an emotion, I would say, oh, that's not important. I don't really need to think about that. I can just, I'll just pretend that I didn't feel that, or I'll just throw that one away. But there is no such thing as throwing an emotion away if you're feeling it strongly enough, as I learned over time. And so what would end up happening is I would think that I had managed it, but it was actually going on a shelf. Eventually it would stack, it would hit a level where I couldn't ignore it anymore, and now I was immediately sucked into my harmony 10-year-old, and I was acting out emotionally. I was feeling betrayed, or I was feeling angry, or whatever the emotional expression was. Now remember, harmony is extroverted feeling, so it is going to be an emotional display. It's not going to be a private inward hurt like we'll see with some of the introverted feeling 10-year-olds, how they express it or how they experience it. It is an extroverted process. So an ENTP may appear totally cool, totally laid back, no problems, everything's fine, and then all of a sudden there's this explosive emotional outburst. And it's usually because they're going to that 10-year-old of harmony. They've allowed something to stack over time. Now, if you're doing that a lot, it means you need to go into your co-pilot, right? If you're an ENTP, it means you got to get out of harmony and go into the co-pilot of accuracy and get back into systematizing these relationships, right? Or these emotional experiences, because that's where you shine, all right? You shine when you can systemize it. Now, other people will tell you that you can't do that with emotional intelligence. You can't systemize it. You can only feel it. And that's because they're feelers, all right? That's because that's the world that they're good in. For you as an ENTP, if you are an ENTP, then that means that you want to create some sort of model or system that makes sense to you to help you manage this emotional component. Now, once you've done that, right, once you have your driver and your co-pilot nice and strong, that's when you can now consult and work on the 10-year-old process of harmony. And what's great about an ENTP or anybody who has harmony anywhere in their car is there is a desire for emotional connectivity. There's always a feeling that just feels really good to emotionally connect. Most people like emotionally connecting. They do it in a slightly different way. But the 10-year-old is still in the conscious part of the car. Remember, it's on the right side of the car, and this is all conscious for the ENTP. So ENTPs enjoy emotional connectivity. but they're leading with accuracy, which is more about an impersonal criteria. And we mentioned before that accuracy enjoys it enjoys an absurd sense of humor. It likes things that are absurd, that tickles its funny bone. And accuracy actually, especially with exploration accuracy together, which is all about new, quick ideas, plus a sense of the absurd, ENTPs can have a brilliant sense of humor. You'll see them as comedians a lot of times, and you'll see them just as like the really super funny kid in class, the class clown, or just a super funny person at work or whatever. They frequently have a good sense of humor. And the reason why that's super satisfying to them is it's a strategy that allows them to emotionally connect with other people through laughter, but it's a safe one, right? It's not a vulnerable, open, now people can hurt me. It's a shared emotional experience that is relatively safe. So ENTPs generally have a great sense of humor in order to honor exploration with quick wit, accuracy with that wry desire to see things in the absurd, and then harmony, which wants to share an emotional experience with another person. But since harmony is the 10-year-old, they want to do it in safe terms. So ENTPs have a tendency to be fairly funny because of that. Now, where does the 3-year-old come in with memory? Now, this is on the left side of the card. So remember, this is going to be unconscious. It's going to be an unconscious part of who they are. And usually it shows up in a time of stress. Now, the other place that I've really seen it show up is if you're using your driver a lot, your 3-year-old will need more time and attention. The reason why is because the brain can only overtax something for so long before it ends up turning on a mechanism that says, we need to give that part of your brain a rest. So we're going to go to the opposite process, and we're going to focus in on that for a little while. And of course, it can look, it can show up in a time of extreme stress, so it can look really bad. It can show up just as a, call to action for the 3-year-old so that the driver gets a bit of a rest. But the 3-year-old is all about that memory process, but it will be a very infantile, unsophisticated version. It's very important to remember. If you've gone through the cognitive functions, you remember that memory is that mosaic of every experience you've ever had. It's very past oriented. It's very connected with its, memories and the experiences it's had and the kind of meaning that they take from that. Well, this is a very undeveloped part of an ENTP. So oftentimes they'll have little to no connection with the past, all right? Or at least they won't consciously do so. They won't consciously really feel like the past is meaningful to them at all, which is another reason why they can leave relationships so quickly. One of the things that is frustrating to somebody who's in a relationship with an ENTP, if they end the relationship, it's like the ENTP just moved on instantly and the other person is still nursing their wounds. Well, they didn't move on. They just put it into the 3-year-old portion, which is unconscious and neglected. So oftentimes what will show up for the ENTP is that if something is a disturbing event or if something is a painful event, they'll instantly compartmentalize it and then it will come up later. All right, they'll have to nurse it later at a time period where they can handle the 3-year-old process because they're really not sure what to do with that information. Another way that it comes up is that, remember, memory likes things to be predictable. It likes to know what the procedure is. It likes to be able to create, just basically the same day that they know that tomorrow will be similar enough to today where they can manage it. Well, for an ENTP, as a 3-year-old, this could, when they go into the 3-year-old experience, because it's infantile, it feels very uncomfortable, it feels very different from how they see themselves. A lot of times it can show up as fated to fail or in a rut, or it will really kind of feel like a straitjacket in some ways, where it's like, I have no options, I have no ability to open frame, I have no ability to do anything new or different. If an ENTP is forced into this position too often, they will get out of their driver to go into the 3-year-old. And remember, your driver is where you get your energy. They will start to experience depression in the form of dysthymia. They'll start to really not feel very good. They'll start to think that they have no control or freedom in their life, that they're fated to be in whatever situation they're in, and they'll just not want to get out of bed in the morning. Now, in a healthy way, it will show up by doing something over and over and over again that is very passive. Most ENTPs appreciate the 3-year-old process of memory by being passively entertained with something that represents safety to them. So watching the same movie over and over, listening to music from when they were in high school, reading the same book over and over, having sort of that security blanket, that mental security blanket where they can attach themselves. Sometimes it's spending time with their family, right? It's just whatever it is that connects you to a safe place that you know is predictable and will be waiting for you. And what's really interesting, we're gonna tomorrow when we go into profiling, we're going to talk about a question that's called the flow question. And what you'll really want to be looking out for is sometimes people will answer the flow question based on their 3-year-old process. And that's because they're using their driver too much. And so they'll go into their 3-year-old as a pleasant escape for a time. So for me, that can look like watching Criminal Minds endlessly, right? Like for 2 days straight. If after I finish this program, I probably will be going and doing that. Like I'll probably just be detoxing by watching my favorite show or reading, you know, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice for the 100th time or whatever. Whatever is the thing that really puts me in a place of R&R, I'll just passively be entertained that way. And it's because I need to go to my 3-year-old because I've been spending so much time in my driver. So that's not uncommon. I just wanted to tag that really quick. So you get an idea of how ENTPs personality types manifest based on their cognitive function set. Now, where do they fall in their firm orientation? They want freedom, right? Unfettered freedom if possible. Well, that's not possible. And so the best thing to do for an ENTP, as opposed to keep pushing for unfettered freedom, is to allow themselves to create a system or a framework with accuracy that makes sense to them and they can be creative within that context, all right? Your combination of your driver and your co-pilot make up for your 3-year-old. So if the 3-year-old memory process is all about infrastructure, right? And ENTPs usually hate infrastructure. They usually hate this idea that they have to be beholden to a system. Oftentimes, doing it in a way that makes sense or having the accuracy process create the system for you is a way to make up for that 3-year-old. All right, so we're going to talk about we're going to talk about ENFPs in a little bit, and ENFPs also lead with exploration, so I want you to tag how accuracy, that systemic piece, has flavored exploration so that you can compare and contrast it with an ENFP. Because sometimes they look very similar. They're showing up with their driver, so that looks really similar. But remember that thinking systemic component to ENTPs. It's very important for remembering that when you're trying to compare them to an ENFP. Systems, when they're not particularly in touch with their emotional components, when they do experience emotions, it's an extroverted emotional experience, and so it's a projection of emotion. It's not getting in touch with their inner emotional experience. And when they need to do that, they do it by systemizing the emotional experience. And what are their behaviors? They're extroverted, they project, they're vivacious, they're outgoing generally. However, it's not extroversion that they get their energy from, it's specifically exploration. And that may or may not have anything to do with other people, okay? If they're exploring the world around them, especially as an ENTP that is not personally motivated, they're impersonally motivated, sometimes exploration can be learning. Sometimes it can be playing a video game. Sometimes it can be just going out and messing with the environment. It doesn't necessarily have to have a personal component in order to get energy, but it does have to be engaging with the environment. So that's very important to remember. Exploration people usually like concepts. They love learning new things. They generally stay at higher rungs of the ladder of abstraction, and because they lead with intuition, okay, and this is important to remember too, those people that lead with an intuitive process have a tendency to be the most comfortable with abstractions. Okay, they're the most comfortable with conceptualization. So those who lead with an intuitive process, whether that be exploration or perspectives, are the ones who are the most comfortable at the top rungs, all right? Because that's a world that is engaging, intriguing, and fuels their driver process. They're probably going to be more vivacious, okay, because they're charismatic and they like engaging with their environment. However, they're still going to be thinkers. And so you will hear the flatness in their voice, especially when they're making a point. And they're perceivers, so they're going to be more expressionistic. However, their accuracy process, which is the part that is the subjective, what should I be wearing component is their secondary co-pilot process. So they're probably going to be slightly less expressionistic in an anarchistic way, right? They're not going to be as insistent on you understanding their inner world. They're probably going to have a bit more of a balance because Harmony is the 10-year-old, and Harmony is still a conscious part of them. So they're still going to check in with this concept of, well, what's appropriate to wear for that event, right? What's appropriate to wear for that particular context. So accuracy and Harmony being the co-pilot and 10-year-old means that if they have to dress up for an event, they'll probably dress up, and if they don't have to, they'll probably dress down. It's going to be a little bit more on the radar, but there'll still be that accuracy piece, which is, if it doesn't make sense for me to dress up, why would I do it? All right, so that's the overview of the ENTP personality type. And again, just when you're running into somebody of this type, these are the kinds of markers that you're going to be looking for.